This video will be split up into 5 parts. 1. The experiment at La Torera. 2. Stoned ape theory. 3. The archaic revival. 4. The mystery of language. And 5. The transcendental object at the end of time. 1. The experiment at La Torera. Anyone familiar with McKenna knows he was an esoteric individual throughout his life. He often referred to himself as a normal person raised in Colorado. From a young age, he was deeply curious, hunting butterflies, dabbling in the occult, and eventually becoming a key figure in the psychedelic renaissance of the 60s and 70s alongside Timothy Leary and Ram Dass. However, the event that truly catalyzed his future views was the experiment at La Torera. It all began when Terence McKenna obtained DMT. Both he and his brother Dennis had prior experience with LSD, but upon trying DMT, they realized it was an entirely different class of psychedelic. The experience profoundly altered their perspective on reality. Terence remarked that he needed a way to slow the train down to fully grasp what was happening, as the DMT trip was too rapid. Through research, they learned about a psychedelic called ukuhe, a plant medicine used by several South American tribes, including the Yanomami and Witoto. One particular intriguing aspect was the claim that users reported encountering little men. McKenna recalled, "It was a little pill they made from the resin of a tree. The literature insisted that they use this ukuhe to speak with little men. The brothers believed that since ukuhe was orally ingested, its metabolic process would extend the psychedelic experience, potentially allowing them to map out the DMT dimension. However, upon arriving at La Torera, they quickly discovered that ukuhe was secondary to the psilocybin cubensis mushrooms growing abundantly in cow pastures. Initially, the mushrooms were consumed casually, a small treat with mild psychedelic effects. However, as their intake increased, the experiences became more profound. One of the most notable effects was the resonance of sound with DNA while under the influence. Dennis McKenna explained, by imitating a sound that we could detect inside our heads on high doses of mushrooms, we could create a resonance with our DNA. This resonance interacting with the tryptamines and beta-carbolines circulating in our system would shift the DNA into a superconducting state, creating a stable standing wave that accessed both individual and phylogenetic information stored within human DNA, or something like that. He further described the experience. The mushrooms were essentially a blueprint for transforming our bodies into an artifact composed of both matter and mind, capable of responding to telepathic commands. This psychobiological artifact, which we call the eschaton, shared much in common with historical super technologies such as UFOs, time machines, and in earlier centuries the Philosopher's Stone or magic mirrors. It was to be the ultimate technological artifact that would transcend all technologies while ending time and history in the process. Our aspirations were as inflated as our manic delusions. Terence McKenna considered this experiment one of the most important experiences of his life. Reflecting on it, he later said, I believe that this is about a discovery so huge that we can't even put a name to it. Columbus could say, I found land. Galileo could say, there are mountains on the moon, but it is for me to say, there are elves inside our heads, our collective head, and that somehow this will have an impact. I'm convinced that it will, that it is for a purpose, that the entire ecology of the planet is attempting to communicate ever more exotic messages to us as the cultural crisis deepens. 2. Stoned ape theory. If you are familiar with Terence McKenna, you likely know about the stoned ape theory, an evolutionary hypothesis developed by McKenna and his family, along with Rupert Sheldrake and Ralph Mitzner. In essence, psilocybin mushrooms enhance visual acuity, increase sex drive, and heighten sensory perception. Ancestral apes that regularly consumed these mushrooms gained a significant evolutionary advantage through natural selection over those that did not. Evolutionary theory suggests that early humans emerged in Africa, which was once a vast forest. As the landscape shifted to grasslands, our ancestors adapted by standing more upright, incorporating more meat into their diet, and refining communication. The stoned ape theory proposes that among these changes, early hominids also began consuming coprophytic, lung-growing mushrooms, which stood several inches tall and had golden or silvery caps. These mushrooms may have played a crucial role in survival. Research by Roland Fisher indicates that small doses of psilocybin enhances survival abilities by improving visual acuity. Additionally, McKenna suggested that mild doses of mushrooms stimulate the language centers of the brain. Apes that consumed these mushrooms had a cognitive advantage over those that did not, an advantage still observable in the distinction between humans and other primates. The most significant aspect of this hypothesis is the symbiotic relationship between humans and mushrooms since the dawn of Homo sapiens. At lower doses, mushrooms enhance sensory perception. At moderate doses, they stimulate language centers. But what about higher megadoses? This is where the theory becomes most intriguing. Looking at early human civilizations, such as the cults of Tammuz, Attis, and Cybele, many share a common veneration for a vegetation goddess. McKenna believed that this was rooted more in their relationship with psychedelic mushrooms than in agriculture itself. Indeed, most pre-Vedic religions contain some connection to mushrooms or other psychedelic plants. McKenna elaborated on this extensively, and I will link the relevant audio and transcripts below. The crux of McKenna's argument is that humanity has always had a deep symbiotic bond with mushrooms. Millennia ago, mushrooms played a central role in shamanic rituals. However, as civilization developed, this bond was severed, leading to societal chaos. McKenna lamented, "We can never return to the state of primal innocence that prevailed on this planet 10,000 years ago. The best we can hope for is to cover our tracks, transform the planet into a garden, and build machines that will pull all the plastic, metal, and glass out of the soil to restore and treasure it." He argued that society is now unconsciously trying to return to its archaic roots, seeking to escape patriarchal structures and political ideology. He called this phenomenon the archaic revival. Having established the transformative influence of La Chorrera and the sacred bond between humans and mushrooms, we now examine what this means for the modern world. McKenna observed a recurring pattern in history. Societies facing crises tend to revive ancient traditions. He explained, "This happened in the Renaissance with classicism. The reason we are in a building like this, thinking the thoughts we think, wearing the clothes we wear, is because Renaissance city-state capitalists dug up Greece and Rome. Signs of this archaic revival manifest in ecological movements, feminism, art, cyberculture, rock and roll music, and most notably psychedelics." A more thorough look into what is meant by McKenna would be in his conversation with Ram Dass. The escape is not into some science fiction future, it's into an archaic recursion of some sort. We once knew everything we needed to know, so what we are trying to find out is lost knowledge, not new knowledge. And if you direct people back toward 10,000, 20,000 years ago, they see a kind of completion of an open-ended future. I see most of what's happened in the 20th century as being unconsciously driven by this fascination with the archaic. For instance, Impressionism deconstructs the hard image of realism and gives you a feeling tone thing, which was very antithetical to the Victorian Edwardian thought. Then Freud and Jung describe different aspects of the unconscious, but to do it, Freud has to talk about repressed primitive sexual imaginings. Jung has to talk about folklore, fairy tales, and mythology. Meanwhile, the Dadaists and the Surrealists are saying we have to break up the linear expectations of the bourgeois mind. And then you get Jackson Pollock and those people who say the image itself has to be thrown out. And then, to my mind, the psychedelic thing in the 60s based on rock and roll and a boundary dissolving psychedelic. We almost by random walk are finding our way towards shamanism, tribalism, and nomadism. We're finding a world made out of mind rather than stuff. 4. The mystery of language. Often when someone takes psychedelics, they describe the experience paradoxically as indescribable. The best they can do is provide a rough approximation, primarily because they were the only ones who truly experienced it. Terence McKenna once remarked about psychedelics, "It's something that no human has ever experienced, and something that no human will ever experience again. Each trip is as unique as it is strange. The ineffability of these experiences presents a challenge, especially considering McKenna's belief that our entire reality is constructed through language. If language shapes our world, yet psychedelics reveal experiences beyond linguistic expression, what does this imply for the archaic revival? Can humanity truly synthesize technology with our unconscious desire to return to shamanic traditions when our primary tool for understanding language is so limited?" McKenna viewed language as an evolving phenomenon, not a finished enterprise. He speculated that its ultimate development would enable communication through visible language, much like the DMT entities or even cephalopods. When describing a DMT trip, McKenna recounted, "I encounter elf machines and a language lesson unfolding around me. If I can manage to stabilize my emotions and maintain some objectivity, I begin to realize that the place I have entered is designed by someone very peculiar who has a limited understanding of human beings but is earnestly trying to create a reassuring environment for us." McKenna and his brother even reported experiencing a form of telepathic communication during their experiment at La Chorrera. He described this moment in True Hallucinations. "And as we walked along, Dennis' occasional comments were, 'It burst over me,' answers to questions that I was thinking but not articulating. I stopped in my tracks. I clearly formed a question in my mind. Dennis had bent beside me, began to answer without waiting for me to articulate my thought aloud. I was dumbfounded." To McKenna, the self-transforming elf machines of the DMT experience represent the apex of language where all linguistic evolution is ultimately headed. He believed our current language system is deeply flawed, overly reliant on assumptions, and riddled with misunderstandings. In contrast, a complete, fully evolved language would be immediate and unambiguous. My idea is that language is a process that is half completed in us as we sit here. And language is really something which wants to be seen, not heard, but that we are on our way to evolving toward this visible language, and we currently are operating with these somewhat substandard acoustical codes where I can make small mouth noises. They go through the air, they stroke your ear. You look in a culturally validated dictionary. If your dictionary is like my dictionary and you understand what's in your dictionary, then we say we are communicating. But in a visual language, in a visibly beheld language, there is no culturally validated dictionary. There is simply a hardwired kind of animal language that we all understand instantly from birth without any cultural acclamation to it because it is the natural language of human beings. If McKenna is correct, then our linguistic future may not lie in refining the spoken and written word, but in transcending it entirely toward a form of communication that is immediate, direct, and fundamentally visual. 5. The transcendental object at the end of time. At last, we arrive at the Ragnarok of McKenna's philosophy, the ultimate reason behind the La Chorrera experiment, the stoned ape theory, the archaic revival, and his ideas on language. McKenna believed that all of history, all knowledge, and all moments in time were converging towards a singular event. Not only everything in the present moment, but all past moments as well are being drawn, compressed, squeezed toward the production of the transcendental object at the end of time, which is nothing less than all time, all space, shrunk down to an atomic dimension and handed back to us. As he put it, if we keep going and going, we are eventually going to get somewhere. McKenna believed that the structure of time itself could be understood through the I Ching, stating, these early Chinese Taoist shamans were penetrating to the very organizational foundation of matter itself. If we examine history, we see long standing civilizations such as Sumer, Egypt, and Ur, each lasting thousands of years. However, in modern times, history appears to be accelerating. Resonances in time are condensing vast epochs into mere decades. McKenna drew comparisons between ancient and modern events, arguing that history repeats itself at an increasingly compressed rate. For example, the Egyptians were the first to implement the god king concept, using Jewish slaves to construct their monuments. Thousands of years later, the Nazis engaged in similar forms of totalitarianism and forced labor. To McKenna, these historical parallels were not mere coincidences but rather manifestations of a deeper resonance in time, one that could be mapped through the I Ching. The Gulf War crisis paralleled the life of Muhammad, and when Muhammad died, the war was over. It was completed at the resonance of his death. I find this kind of thing very suggestive and quite uncanny. We are living through, in a 67-year period that stretches from 1945 to 2012, a compressed version of a larger historical epic 4,306 years long that also ends in 2012. McKenna saw history as a spiraling fractal tightening as it accelerates towards an inevitable singularity. He predicted that between 1945 and 2012, humanity would experience a compressed version of a historical cycle spanning 4,306 years. As we neared 2012, history itself will condense even further. And not only must the entire last 4,000 years of history be compressed into the 67-year period from 1945 to 2012, but there is a 384-day period preceding December 22nd, 2012, when the last 67 years and the last 4,300 years have to be compressed into that. Then there's a final 6-day period when all of these things are compressed again. And so, don't you see what's happening? The spiral is tightening as it goes faster and faster. The resonances are impinging. The thing is getting nuttier and nuttier and nuttier as computers link all cultures together. All information barriers dissolve. Everything is becoming connected to everything else. This, according to McKenna, meant that time itself was accelerating toward a singularity, a moment when all novelty, all history, and all events of the universe would occur in a single Planck moment. This singularity, he argued, was the inevitable culmination of increasing complexity and interconnectedness. For McKenna, psychedelics played a crucial role in navigating this impending transformation. The more humanity embraces wonder, expands consciousness, and challenges cultural norms, the better prepared we will be for this transition. Our responsibility is not merely to passively experience the singularity, but to guide ourselves toward it in a meaningful way. As he concluded, our world is in a crisis because of the absence of consciousness, and so to whatever degree any one of us can bring back a small piece of the picture and contribute it to the building of the new paradigm, then we participate in the redemption of the human spirit. And that, after all, is what it's really about. That's it, folks. Thank you very much.